It gets even more complicated as we go forward in time into the Hellenistic period. This is when Greek culture begins to influence Jewish life from the year 300 going forward, BCE. First of all, Jews begin to get attracted to Greek culture. For example, they like to go to the gym. Well, remember, Greek gyms were done naked. And Jewish men going into the Greek gym looked different than Greek men. And the Greeks generally did not like marking the body. They didn't like tattoos, they didn't like amputations, and they didn't like circumcision. So some Jews who wanted to try to fit in more either tried to minimize or hide the sign that they were circumcised, and some might have chosen even to not circumcise their son so they could more readily fit in to the broader Greco-Roman culture. They began to wear Greek clothing, cut their head and hair in the Greek style, teach their children Greek. Around the year 200 BCE, the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek in Alexandria. It's what's today called the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. But that most likely was done because the Jewish community didn't understand the Hebrew anymore, and they needed it in a language they understood. And they were teaching their kids Greek for commercial and cultural purposes, and so they needed the Hebrew Bible put into Greek as well. It became the basis of the Christian Old Testament, but this is 200 years BC. This is long before there's a Christianity that first translation. The Septuagint, that Greek translation of the Bible, becomes the basis for the Christian Old Testament, but it isn't Christian yet because there's no Jesus yet. It's 200 years before year zero. So it was done for Jewish cultural reasons because they were becoming part of the broader Hellenistic world. Did you have a question? Or comment?
I'm just
okay.
Well, I do.
It's a really interesting and understandable presentation.
Okay. Beverly,
I'm just thinking about the Greek upholding of the human body, the whole attitude of the mind, and how I'm wondering, and this for another day, how the Septuagint differed in the attitude of how modern was it?
Any translation is a translation in value and content. It's not just word for word.
That's right.
You don't always have the direct translation. So, a famous example of this is in Isaiah. They translated a word differently than I would have, because the Hebrew word says a young girl will have a child. But when they translated it into Greek, they used the word virgos, which means both virgin and young girl. But in the Hebrew, there are two separate words for a virgin and a young girl. And in the original Hebrew, it was just young girl. But when you put it into virgos in Greek, now the idea of the virgin birth becomes a prophecy that Isaiah made, when that might not have been what Isaiah said at all in the Hebrew. So all kinds of subtle examples like that then become the fodder for Christian interpretation later. So there are all kinds of examples where it shifts a bit. There's also some suggestions that the original Hebrew text that the people used to make the Septuagint may have been different from the Hebrew text we have now. A word here or a word there might have been subtly different, because when they translated it, if it said, this is not a real example, but if they said, he walked in the room and saw dogs and cats in the Septuagint, and in the Hebrew Bible we have now it says, he walked in the room and saw dogs, you figure dogs, cats, those are pretty easy words to translate. So if they're different, maybe the Hebrew original the Greeks had was different, or they decided to make it more interesting and add both animals in. There's a whole school of what's called secondary criticism that's exploring the exact words of the text and who wrote what when and which is the right version, and people dive into that in a very detailed way. Using the Septuagint as one of the pieces of evidence for what might have been the original text. So, we're familiar with the Hanukkah story, right? Where these evil Greeks came in from outside and were trying to force all the Jews to be like Greeks. Actually, there were a fair number of Jews who liked what the Greeks were selling and were interested in Greek culture and practice. The very first person who's killed in the Maccabean rebellion, as described in the books of Maccabees, is a Jew. It's a Jew who's stepping forward to offer a sacrifice to the Greek gods. And Mattathias takes his sword and kills him on the altar, and then kills the governor, or the general who's making him do it. So the first casualty is a Jew who's a Hellenizing Jew. And there were Hellenizing Jews in this time period. And the Maccabees were the old country, hill country pietists who were imposing their religion on others. They would forcibly circumcise Jewish men they found who were not circumcised. They even conquered a neighboring country and forcibly converted them to Judaism. The Idumeans, who live in what today is Petra, in that area of Jordan. This idea of Hellenism in Jewish life was attractive to some, was rejected by others. It's not as simple as the classic Maccabee stories presented. And over time, even the Maccabees got Hellenized. So they started with wonderful, strong Judean names like Mattatyahu and Yehuda, Judah. And after a couple generations, they become Hyrcanos and Aristobulus and even Alexander. Like Alexander, the worst, right?
Wow.
But they pick up these these Greek names. The book of Maccabees that we have now are in Greek. They're not in Hebrew, because that was the language of civilized courts. So even the Maccabees themselves were not immune to the lures of Hellenistic culture. So by the time of, let's say, the year 0, the Jewish community was basically in 3 different places. There were Jews in Babylon and Mesopotamia who were still there from that old dispersion. There were Jews in Judea proper, descended from those who came back and those who stayed. And there was about a third of the Jews in the Greco-Roman world, mostly in Alexandria, Egypt, which was like the New York City of the day.
Sorry, could you just say that again?
Sure.
Judea, Alexandria, and where?
Babylon, the leftover from the exile who were living in, or you could also call it Mesopotamia, between the rivers, what's Iraq today. So the eastern diaspora, Judea proper, and the western diaspora in Alexandria and the Greco-Roman world. There were Jews in Rome going back to the 1st century CE. And most of them speak Greek. They live a Greek lifestyle, but they maintain themselves as different. They don't eat pork. They don't worship idols. They're Hellenized Jews. They're living a Greek value system. And in fact, even the word diaspora is not necessarily a negative word. When they were sent into exile in the East, it was called exile, galut, or golus, Yiddish pronunciation. What does exile mean? It means you're not where you belong. You should be in your homeland, and you're not there. You want to go back. If you're in diaspora comes from the word dia, which means the spreading out, like a diagram, and spore, which means seeds. So a diaspora is a spreading of seeds. And the seeds take root where they are, and they grow a little bit different in different soil and different stuff. It's a very organic sense of dispersion. It doesn't have to be terrible. In fact, the first use of diaspora was toward Greek city-states propping up all along the Mediterranean. They were not in Greece, but they were living Greek culture in foreign lands. So Jews were part of that broader Hellenistic world. And interestingly enough, when they started doing their religious services in Greek, it became interesting to non-Jews to find out what's going on in these Jewish meeting houses, because they could understand it now. And so you begin to hear testimony of people that are called God-fearers. They stand in the back of the synagogue, just like they'd be in the temple of the non-Jews at Jerusalem, but they listen to what's going on, and they're interested in believing in this one God and what he wants them to do. The problem is that they don't want to circumcise themselves. They don't want to change their diet and cut themselves off from the broader world. And they don't necessarily want to abandon their family, and cut themselves off, because again, it's an ethno-religious identity. There isn't a sense that you can have a purely religious identity that crosses ethnic boundaries until later times. So now, by the end of the 1st century of the Common Era, let's say by the year 100 CE, now the temple has been destroyed. The priests are out of luck, because they had put all their eggs in one basket in the Jerusalem temple, which was great when it was there. They had the monopoly, but if there were one McDonald's and it burned down in a grease fire, that would be the end, right?
Greek grease fire.
Right. Any grease
fire.
G-R-E-E-C, right?
How to do that?
In this case, it was a Roman fire.
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Similar.
Anyways, but the point is that they now had to come up with some other way of identifying as Jews.